Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Educatedcollins Snap channel. How you doing? So today we're going to be going over a series 4 and 5 token buy list. It's been around 2 months since I did the last one, and after doing it, finalizing, a lot has changed since the last video. So we're going to get into it. I haven't made a series 3 list because I feel like that one is more still up to date, where this one is definitely a lot different. And we're going to be watching the Twitch Rivals if you want to take a look at that in a couple hours. So tune in for that. But let's get started on the video. So first off, we have this first section. This is going to be the big bads, plus they're overpowered. So these are the overpowered, in my opinion, big bads of the meta right now. That's going to be High Evolutionary and Galactus. I wouldn't say this is necessarily like left to right, but it's pretty close, and there's not that many in each tier, so you can kind of view that. But I do think Galactus and High Evolutionary are going to be the better big bats to pick up if you want to pick up something that's always going to be 6,000 tokens. High Evolutionary came out recently, and it's really just been a core part of the meta ever since. There's just so much flexibility with this card in particular, and the power of Hulk is not to be understated with the whole repertoire. Was Hulk and a lot of times Cyclops or so has really been dominating and really been showing up in a lot of pieces. It's not hard to put that core in, and it just kind of reminds me of the Dark Hawk core, where you have Zabu, Rockslide, and Dark Hawk. It's kind of like the same thing, where you're running High Evolutionary, Hulk, and Wasp to kind of give you that engine of power. So yeah, very, very strong card. It turns out very powerful. I know it still says the 7 stats, but it is a 4/4. It did get nerfed, rightly so, before the drop. So, and then Galactus is just a really powerful tool for climbing. Even when people know they're playing Galactus, it's still sometimes hard to have the exact counters. And when it does hit, you do win. And another thing about Galactus is you can like bait people into leaving, where they don't know if you have the exact answer, they don't know if you have all the reads, so you can just pressure people into leaving even if you don't necessarily have that set up. And it's just a pretty annoying archetype to play with, but even though it's so annoying, you still see a lot of it because it works. So that's the unfortunate part. It's good enough that even if people are playing cards to counter you, it still works. It still has enough of power that people still are saying, yeah, people can draft it against me, but I still have enough success that I'll play it. So, and the stats don't lie. The stats do say these two are really by far like the best big bats to be picking up in this current metagame. So that's the first line. Second line is not big bads, but also I would say are in the OP level territory. So that's going to be Jeff, Kitty Pryde, Hidmonkey. Kitty Pryde and Hidmonkey are usually run in very similar decks, so they kind of have intrinsic stat values, but they're just really good in the decks that they do work in. Bounce and just Sarah, Monkey, those two really do have a lot of value. Kitty Pryde just gets a lot of stats for very cheap, and especially with Beast, you can just have it for 0 power. And people are innovating on the archetype, the bounce archetype, and making new deck lists that can deal with the meta. So it's not a very like one-dimensional comp as it used to be. There's people making new lists with, I mean, I'm not going to spoil their ideas, but like Invisible Woman and stuff like that, to just kind of have different answers to the current metagame landscape. So it's not as one-dimensional as you may think. If you're still thinking about the old bounce list, people are making it better, making it more resilient to the common counters that you usually see in a bounce archetype. And now Jeff is just a really, really good 2, like a really flexible 2-drop, has a lot of usability. It used to be Lizard was the premium 2-drop of choice, but they nerfed Lizard and they released Jeff. And Jeff just counters a lot of things, and it fits into Lockdown pretty easily. If people want to play, what's that one called? Professor X or anything, any location that prevent you from playing into a particular area, you can just Jeff into it and mitigate that downside. So its power comes from the fact that it's so flexible and just opens you up into a lot of situations where no other card could give you an answer except for Jeff itself. And the stats do show that it is a really powerful tool and very consistent when you can play with it. So those are the I don't I wouldn't say no to you getting these at all. Like if you want any of these, you got in late and you don't have Kitty Pryde and you really want to play the bounce archetype and that's what you're missing, yeah, sure, go for it. So most people have Kitty Pryde, so that one is like not a problem, but the other is four. If you want one of them, definitely feel free. So now these middle three that are coming up are solid, but they're not stand out in any meaningful way where they have to go into the OP territory. So the first one is just Galactus and M.O.D.O.K. So the reason why these are like right next to each other is because they help supplement good archetypes, or they help Galactus essentially. So Knull helps Galactus. They're kind of tied together. You can play Knull in a destroy packer without Galactus, but it's really just shines in the Galactus engine, and its stats just are very strong when you have the Knull there. And when you don't have Knull with Galactus, it does feel a little weird. So if you are trying to play that Galactus engine, you don't need Knull 100%, but it is noticeably better if you do have a Knull in there. So I have to include like this is something you might want to be looking into. Now M.O.D.O.K works for discard, and discard stats have always been pretty respectable ever since M.O.D.O.K came out. It's just that some people just don't like playing discard or whatever. They don't like the Apocalypse playstyle where you're telegraphing and showing people, oh, I'm playing all these cards. But when discard works, it works so well that it's hard to deny that it's a powerful archetype to play. And this card gives you that main tool you need. If you don't have M.O.D.O.K, you're kind of relying on Hell Cow, and it's just not the same. It doesn't have the same power, and you do have some synergies with Hela if you want to go that direction. But generally, it's one of the main core pieces for creating a whole new playstyle to play with that is viable, and that's why it's up here in this next corner, because it creates its arc. It supplements the archetype and makes it really competitively viable by itself. So definitely a pretty good card to pick up. Next up, we have Thanos and Zabu. Now normally, right, Thanos is like all the way at the top and whatnot, but really in this current climate, Thanos isn't as as powerful as it used to be. It's still pretty decent in tournament play, right? But that's not really what I'm recommending here. That's not really the tier list for it. This is for like people that are trying to like get into the game, play ladder, and really understand how to what's good for the ladder. And really Thanos is okay, but a lot of the good Thanos decks are being piloted with high evolutionary. So if you don't have high evolutionary, the Thanos decks are going to feel a little bit iffy, not as premium. There are still some good Thanos decks that are just like playing pure Thanos or locked on Thanos without high evolutionary, blah blah blah. But a lot of the high performing Thanos decks are really just high evolutionary decks with a Thanos in it. So it's hard to say, oh, Thanos is doing great when all the decks that are doing well for Thanos just have high evolutionary. If you're gonna pick between high evolutionary and Thanos, well, then get the high evolutionary, which gives you a lot more options before you pick up the Thanos. But it is good in high evolutionary decks, and it's good. There are some decks that still work with high evolutionary with Thanos, but it's usually on the back burner. You need the high evolutionary first, so I would definitely lean towards that before you go there. But obviously it's a big bad, so if you want to pick it up for the future, you definitely can. But in this current landscape, I wouldn't necessarily say it's some of the best things to get, unfortunately. So just keep that in mind. You can still get it, but I would say there are definitely better options. Now Zabu has the same thing where it's really taken it hold and really works very well with high evolutionary. With the introduction of the thing with high evolutionary itself, you can now run Zabu and then play the thing on 3 or high evolutionary if you don't have anything else. So it's really standing on its own. This used to really be tied to Darkhawk and really be tied to Mr. Negative. But with the introduction of high evolutionary, you don't really need to be playing Darkhawk with Zabu anymore. You don't really need to play negative or anything like that with Zabu anymore. You can just play Zabu into high evolutionary decks. Don't run the Darkhawk, and you'll do absolutely fine. So because of that, I'm now changing the metrics, and I'm saying Dark Zabu is a little bit better than Darkhawk in this particular climate because you don't really need Darkhawk anymore, and the stats of Darkhawk aren't really like super duper impressive anymore. It's really high evolutionary kind of showing through, and anything that can really work well with high evolutionary or be able to deal with high evolutionary can really stand on its own. So that's why Zabu's here. Now the next one is just good cards generally. So just good general cards, cards that are strong and not really have any issues. So here we have Darkhawk, Ironlight, Stature, and Kang. So Kang once again is a big bad. This is very low. The issue is that there's just not a lot of people playing Kang, and the stats of the people playing Kang is just not very impressive. And especially in ladder, I would say tournament play is a little different. You can definitely have some advantages in using Kang in tournament play, but in ladder, it's a slow card. It takes a lot of time for the animation to play, and you can usually get like more games done if you just don't have a Kang deck. And a lot of times the Kang doesn't necessarily save you. The best thing about Kang is it allows you to snap and then play Kang, and if your opponent feels scared, then you get free cubes. So there, like your cube rate is probably going to be better with a Kang in it, but it is a slow card, and sometimes you lose a draw, so you're not necessarily having more options to play. If you actually want to win the match, the Kang is giving you less options because you're losing a draw essentially, right? This doesn't give you a draw. So there are some big downsides to playing it with it being slower and etc. But it's not a bad card, but the stats aren't so prevalent that I can say, oh, it's up next to Thanos or up next to High Evolutionary Galactus. It's just in like the good cards generally slot, but nowhere else. And then we have Darkhawk, still solid card. It's just not as necessary with High Evolutionary being in play. A lot of people are playing that, and Darkhawk isn't like that bad, but it isn't like super necessary. Ironlight kind of has the same issue. Like it's not a bad card, but there's usually like only a couple of decks that are running it, and you can't really run it that cleanly in High Evolutionary because you can hit a lot of pretty bad targets. Like you don't really want Wash, you don't really want High Evolutionary, so it doesn't really work super well into those matchups or into those deck lists. So it just doesn't feel as good. And then Stature got nerfed. It's now at 5-6. I still think the deck is good. The Jeff Stature deck, I still think it's very strong. And especially now that people are playing it less, right? You can surprise people more with it coming out. So I'm not really worried about the deck list or the archetype or anything. It's just that there's a lot of other deck lists that perform very well now, so you don't have to rely on Stature. It used to be the best deck in the game, but they double nerfed Black Bolt, they nerfed Stature, and now I wouldn't say it's the best deck or anything like super close to that. So that's why it's down here a little bit here. And then the next section is just careful buys. I wouldn't necessarily encourage any of the rest of these. They're just not really worth spending 6,000 or 3,000 tokens on. So Nimrod, I would say is like the closest where you could almost justify it, but it's really mostly used in Galactus, and you really don't need to play a Nimrod version of Galactus to climb. You don't. So the best deck like doesn't really need it, right? And that kind of thing just shows you like, oh, maybe it's not like worth spending your hard-earned tokens to get something that you don't even need to run in your deck list. That's the same thing with Howard the Duck, right? You want it for Ironlight, but the best decks don't even run it, don't even care. So it's like, what is the real purpose? Howard the Duck stats aren't necessarily bad, but a lot of the best decks are like playing Galactus or something, with Iron Ladder, and so it's just like Galactus deck, right? So it's just like, is this really carrying the deck? Probably not. But yeah, the ones at the top aren't bad cards, but they're just not worth the tokens. So that's the difference. Like these cards are not bad, right? But I wouldn't feel comfortable recommending anyone to spend 3,000 or 6,000 tokens on any of these cards. And then the ones at the bottom, I would say, are just generally bad. So I know Living Tribunal just came out, right? But the stats are just not helpful. And the deck list, no one's really talking about it being good. There's obviously some people hyping it up, and there's some cool ideas floating around, but it just feels like the power is not worth it a lot of times to make it feel like a viable option. And anytime people are doing well, it's because they got perfect hits, right? And if you get perfect hits with any deck, you should win, usually, right? So it's kind of weird to say, oh yeah, this works, but I hit perfectly. And then Shanna and Snowguard just don't have really a good place in the meta at all. There's nothing really making it stand out. The weird thing about cards is you have to compare every card you play with every other card in the game, basically, right? So anytime you're playing a Shanna, you're thinking this could be something else completely, and it's just not as good. So not really sold on the Shanna, not really sold on the Snow Guard here. Same thing with the Tribunal. I could definitely see Tribunal moving in a direction. The only direction's up as more cards are added, but for now it's just not worth the investment of tokens. So overall, that's the list here. Let me know what you think. I do think it is a little bit different in how I'm presenting it, just showing, but I hope I gave enough of a reason that it makes some sense to you, even if you disagree with some of them. So that's all we have today. Hope you guys enjoy it. Let me know if you want more of this stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Da 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 da.
Educated Collins snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills